All right, welcome everybody to the last morning of the conference. I'm Gran. I'm up at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. I'm going to be moderating this panel discussion. And of course, really the action happens over here with our panelists. I'm going to give brief introductions for each of the panelists, and then I'm going to give them, 5-10 minutes or so to kind of explain a little bit more who they are and what their perspective is on extreme events. This panel is basically discussing the role of extreme events with a focus particularly on stream restoration and how we deal with that. So I guess I'm going to start here. This is Chris Kleist. He's the stormwater coordinator for the city of Duluth. He's been in that role for about 8 years now. So he deals with things like MS4 compliance, and he's also been dealing with a lot of the restoration work associated with an extreme event that we had in Duluth in July of 2012. He has degrees from UMD, a business degree from there, and water resources degree from Vermilion Community College. Next we have Bob Gubernick. He's a geologist who works for the USDA Forest Service, Eastern Region. His official title is a watershed restoration geologist, which in my mind actually sounds like the perfect job. He's been working in the field since 1985, and a lot of his work focuses on aquatic organism and fish passage. He's also worked on several extreme events, including Hurricane Irene, which hit New England, as well as the Boulder flood that happened 2 years ago, or was that 1 year ago? 2 years ago. Next we have Marty Rye. Marty Rye is a hydrologist who also works for the U.S. Forest Service. He is formerly from Interfluve. He has degrees in ag engineering and civil engineering from the University of Minnesota, or the U. He has some nice perspectives on sort of stream restoration as well as stream management in general. So he's going to provide that aspect. And he's also based up in the Duluth office, and so he also got to deal with the 2012 flood. And then lastly, we have Ray Wolf, who he works for the National Weather Service in Davenport, Iowa. He's the Science and Operations Officer there. And he's going to talk a little bit more about what that means and what his role is. He has bachelor's and master's degrees from Iowa State in meteorology and climatology. And he brings to the table a nice perspective on sort of what the climate is like and potential future climate scenarios in this region. And so with that, I'm going to let each of you guys actually say a little bit more about who you are and your take on extreme events or your experience with extreme events. And so, Chris, do you want to start?
Good morning, guys. Can you hear me okay? So, who recalls the Duluth flood of 2012? Raise your hand. A lot of folks. Okay, so during that event, that was June 19th and 20th of 2012, we received between 6 and 10 inches of rain in about 24 hours. And Duluth is a steep city. Have you guys been to Duluth before? So Duluth drops about 800 feet from the top of the hill to Lake Superior in about a mile. So it's a very steep city. Clay soils, shallow bedrock. So with that volume of water, the erosion was significant along the stream channels. That flood caused about $100 million of damage to Duluth and the surrounding areas, about $50 million in damage to the city of Duluth. So very significant. That was washouts of roads, culverts, bridges, trails, lots of infrastructure. It also damaged stream banks, washed out those clay banks, as well as when there were upstream washouts of culverts and roads, the debris was deposited in the stream channels downstream. So my project has been stabilizing the eroded stream banks as well as removing the debris that washed in from upstream washouts. The funding we received is for disaster recovery. It's not necessarily stream restoration per se, but it's more bank stabilization to protect infrastructure, culverts and bridges and trails. If that includes stream work, stream channel work, that's great. If it includes habitat improvements, that's even better. But the focus of the funding is bank stabilization and debris removal. We estimated the project would cost about $12.6 million, which was an early estimate. We think it's pretty accurate. The city has received so far about $7.7 million in funding. Our local SWCD has also received about $4 million in funding, so we're close to the $12 million goal. Again, I guess wrapping up, the projects are mostly bank stabilization projects that sometimes involve moving a stream channel, creating a new channel with natural channel design, but the focus is bank stabilization to protect infrastructure. Does that make sense? All right, that's me. Bob, you're next.
Good morning. Thanks for sticking with us. My experience with extreme events, I'll speak specifically on Tropical Storm Irene. Happened in August of 2011. Dropped about anywhere from 8 to 12 inches of rain in the northeastern New England, affecting New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut, Massachusetts in there. Had some pretty devastating effects. Essentially, human beings get to kind of feel like the fish with habitat fragmentation, washed out numerous bridges, isolated communities. I spent most of my time in Vermont helping the communities, working on federal crossings, things like that. The response was tremendous. The governor suspended all legal requirements for permitting, and everybody that had a piece of equipment was in the stream trying to prevent the next flood. And what wound up happening is that, of course, the massive excavation, channelization of streams, an extreme fear-based response. And the biggest thing that needs to happen with these kind of things is support from people who can help these communities, more hands on the ground that understand streams to make proper decisions. Again, when you're operating in the realm of fear, you have far overreaching consequences and essentially affect the next flood. You may suppress some smaller floods, but the next big flood can have even more catastrophic things. So things like pulling out roughness and steep channels, causing further incision, undermining the bank protection that they've robbed from the stream to put at the edge of the stream happening. One of the good things that we found is that the stream simulation design methodology that the Forest Service uses, we have several examples there where all the culverts and undersized structures around failed, and those structures made it through without any need for maintenance whatsoever. So we do have some techniques, and I can't underemphasize the need to educate the public on really how streams function and what's good and bad practices after a flood. Marty?
Greetings. I was thinking about this morning when I woke up, and I was just kind of thinking about El Paso. Kind of a unique career path that I wouldn't have selected or understood. But when I first started, I worked for the DNR as a hydrologist, and went out to Renville County, around Olivia, Minnesota, which is the corn capital of the world. So says the Minnesota Senate, so Iowa might have something to say about that. But so there's a big event there in '93, and I was out there with FEMA and in the flood response there. And so we went around to all the townships and communities and looked at the flood damage of the ditch systems and transportation systems and infrastructure. And that was really that first response deal where you had to go and drive around and look at each spot and come up with a very quick scope and a very quick budget and a very quick design. We got out of the car, but that was not much more than that sometimes. And then write a check to these communities to get their transportation systems back in play, which you're probably familiar with. There wasn't a lot of time for big macroscopic planning, and that's one of the things I think it took from that is the importance of large-scale planning to actually think about the impacts and how you should react and what kind of future designs and whatnot. Then I went to work for a regional engineering firm, SEH, and did a lot of work in urban areas and actually urban watershed planning, and both in the doing watershed plans and implementing designs and whatnot. So that was from an urban perspective, and both reacting to and designing for large flood events and whatnot. And then I worked for Interfluve, and again looking at streams and whatnot. And then the other experience I had was just kind of a couple firsthand experiences of there's a large flood event in 2008 in southeastern Wisconsin. You probably remember that, Andy. it was kind of cool to watch. There's a couple things that take-home messages there. It was the Rock River, the Crayfish River, or crawfish, sorry, they call it crawfish. It was kind of neat to see because it was up pretty near the whole growing season, and I thought for sure you'd see a big die-off of the riparian trees. And so these cottonwoods and stuff, they basically lost a growing season. It was really cool. I didn't see any die-off the years after that. I don't know if you've seen it since, but I was kind of thinking, cool, get the big die-off and big introduction of wood, but it really didn't happen, so those trees are pretty cool. And then we were at the epicenter. I live in Esco, Minnesota, which had the 10 inches of rain, and that was kind of cool because, well, cool for me, I didn't get flooded out, but the neighbors had some issues. But it was interesting to see that 15-inch CMPs were actually blowing out bituminous roads. And these had drainage areas of backyards. So this is very, very small, but they were enough to blow out roads and actually interrupt the transportation system. There was one way to kind of get in and out of Esco. Everything else had blown out, and the public service, the public works entities for Duluth, the county, and the city there were really amazing. They got that thing back up and running in a couple of days. Now, I would have probably changed the design about 80% of what they replaced, but having said that, their job was to get things back up and running. And so again, there's kind of some of the other take-home message, I think, is to think about how to plan your infrastructure and think about being able to have that information available when an event like that does occur. And I'll just take one more minute. The other thing I did is the forest hydrologist for the Superior National Forest, and I was just looking at, I think beyond floods, we also have to think about other disturbances. So on the National Forest, there's the 1999 blowdown, which I don't know if you recall hearing about. There's a very large blowdown that occurred in the forest. Predates my work with the Forest Service, but it certainly had a large impact. And it was a large natural disturbance and has a big ecological impact and then impact to potential fire danger for local communities and whatnot. So that was an interesting natural event. We've had large fires. The Cavity, Hand Lake, and Pagami Fire. Pagami Fire was the largest fire in Minnesota, and that's, again, the same kind of thing. You're thinking about what the impacts natural systems are, introduction of wood. We didn't see streams blowing up on any of those. The streams in northern Minnesota are kind of bomb-proof in a couple different ways. Either they're pretty hard armored on the North Shore or over the hill. You have a lot of, it's real flat and you have a lot of lakes and they're real low gradient, low energy systems, and so they're not necessarily privy to blowing up a lot. And two other things I was going to mention is there's two other large events. The 2012 event that Chris mentioned, that was a little bit south of the forest, but it did occur. It was a large event on the forest as well. We didn't really have any infrastructure. The crossings and whatnot came out fine. Lost some road gravel and whatnot, but it really wasn't a big issue. But if you looked at the impact of the road systems, especially Highway 61, debris is really the big deal in forested systems, and that's the item that you really have to plan for in your infrastructure. And then if you look at the 2012 event, that was the other thing in going around. I looked at the I'm probably talking too long, but
I'll cut you off eventually.
all right. I looked at the distribution of the 2012 event, and it's kind of interesting because I compared it to all these other synthetic events, distributions for rainfall distributions. You guys know about the synthetic rainfall distributions? You come up with kind of pretend distributions and you apply that with the rainfall depth and get some runoff. And there's some kind of ways to try and guess at that. So I compared that to the synthetic rainfall distributions, and it's actually the Duluth event was not as nested. It wasn't that intense. In fact, the most intense 15 minutes was about a 5-year event. But if you went around and looked, so the reason that's interesting, you can look at the infrastructure and whatnot and see if is it inlet control or not. And one thing I noticed, if you probably went around, is your catch basins. Initially, when you design some urban stuff, you assume some debris that's clogging up your catch basins. But then, over time, most communities say, nah, that's kind of, I don't want to buy that. So kind of one design philosophy is you assume 50% debris clogged during your event. But cities don't do that. But guess what? You go around and look at that event, and there's a lot of catch basins plugged up with debris, overtopped, ripped up the side, and actually had impact on the streams. And so the one thing I think that's important to think about these large events is they're not just water. They're obviously sediment, but there's a lot of debris. And you have to think about that in your infrastructure design, both municipal and ag and whatnot. So I think that's about the last thing. The other thing was there's another event in 2008 was a large event in Gran, washed out. I don't know if we were there and looked at it. Actually, we eroded bedrock channels, and that big thing there is the impact of your drainage system in concentrating flow. So what happened is the streams in the forest weren't very problematic, but when they came to a road that concentrated a number of different streams and came down into one crossing, that's where the DOTs and other folks had a lot of problems, but the crossings and whatnot down the forest weren't a problem. And the final thing I was going to mention is thinking about impending big, large events. I think there's an opportunity to plan for one right now, and that's the emerald ash borer. So what is going to happen if that comes in and kills a whole bunch of ash, and eventually you have a large introduction of large wood in streams? So are people going to freak out? Is this a big problem or not? Is it okay? If you look at some of the research, some of these large events that's how wood gets introduced in there. So I think there's maybe some time, and some of you folks out in your different management perspectives, to think about that and say, you know what, in a few years, if this EAB comes and knocks out, it'll be okay. Everybody relax. It's not, it'll be okay. Or, yep, we gotta go out and cut these and stuff. So I'll stop talking and go from there. So sorry about talking too much.
I worked at the National Weather Service, and we exist in our form today in particular because of extreme events. You're probably familiar with us as we're the providers of the routine weather forecasts and warnings, generally for the next week. You can get those directly from our website. We provide them to the media who may or may not use them in their form. The media is indeed partners in getting out our message regarding these extreme events. And in 2014, on a national basis, I think there were about a dozen events that caused damage in excess of $1 billion. And this is one of the things that NOAA, our parent agency, has been tracking for quite some time, is the trend in dollar corrected amounts, the number of billion-dollar disasters, and they do seem to be going up. We believe there are two things going on there. Part of it is an increased frequency from a strictly climatological standpoint of some of these extreme events, and they can range anywhere from severe weather, winter weather, hurricanes and tropical storms, floods and flash floods, as well as drought and fires on the other end of the water spectrum. But there's also an increased vulnerability from a societal aspect. As we increase our footprint on the face of the earth, we become more vulnerable. Rising sea levels are problematic along our coasts. And I'll use an example, particularly if you remember the Joplin tornado in Missouri from several years ago. Quite a number of fatalities. It actually took out an entire hospital. If that tornado had hit Joplin 20 years earlier, the interstate interchange where it did most of the significant damage had no commercial infrastructure there at all. It would have just been farm fields. But as the population grows and we continue to develop, we become more vulnerable in that spatial events. But to kind of localize the extreme impacts, talk about a couple of the events that we've had basically in the backyard here. Of course, 2008 was the big flood in the Iowa Cedar Basin. You probably saw that on the national news in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. That was a flood of record. Here locally, in the end of July of 2011 in Dubuque, we had a flash flood event, 10.5 inches of rain occurring during the evening and overnight hours. Galena, just east of here, had 13.5 inches of rain in the same period. There were 3 fatalities with that event. The Apple River in northwest Illinois, the USGS gauge was physically overtopped by the flood crest. So something I'm sure the folks who installed that gauge way back when never anticipated happening. Virtually all of the tributary rivers here in eastern Iowa and northwest Illinois have had record crests within the last 5 to 10 years. And some significant impacts there. The Maquoketa River, just to our west, there's a dam, Lake Delhi Dam, broke because of the flows through. It's the concrete and earthen dam mix, and the earthen dam part gave way. But it's not just on the heavy rainfall side that we're seeing impacts. Since 2005, depending on the area here you're in locally, we've been through 3 droughts. So we're seeing a fundamental change in the distribution of precipitation that I think particularly makes things a challenge. And one of the interesting aspects of the 2012 drought, and this was somewhat on a national level, and especially down in the Texas area, we had some back and forth discussions on this, is the impact of lack of water on the energy industry. And in particular, the Cordova nuclear power plant near the Quad Cities uses Mississippi River water to cool its facility. Now they're required by Illinois DNR to return that water to the river at a certain temperature for ecological purposes. Well, the river was so low and the temperature so warm that the water coming into the plant wasn't sufficiently cool to cool down their equipment, and their cooling ponds could not get the water temperature back to what the requirement was. So they had to get a waiver from the DNR to return that water to the river at a higher temperature. So certainly there was probably some sort of ecological impact there, but the important take-home message for that for us was the importance of water in energy production. So that's a concern as well. And also on a local note, just in routine conversations with county engineers especially, it used to be a lot of the design stuff, if you're from my generation, the rainfall frequencies was based on an atlas that was developed in the 1960s. Big old large paper atlas that some of the older engineers are probably familiar with. Well, it took our agency quite a while, but we've now updated that precipitation atlas, and that's online. If you Google the NOAA Atlas 14, you'll get the latest precipitation frequency data, and that's important because the conversations with county engineers have told me that the rules of the game are changing. What used to be a certain size culvert and a certain size subbasin years ago would have worked fine. Those rules aren't working anymore. So it's interesting from my perspective when I understand the science behind climate change and I can look at the data from across the country, but especially in the upper Midwest with respect to precipitation, and see these changes, and then go out to talk to folks and hear from their perspective these anecdotal stories of the impact. It really bring things home and gives us some tangible impacts to be concerned about, which I know you all are acutely aware of, but for folks who don't have the science background either on the biology side or the physics side, it can sometimes be quite an educational effort to get them over the hump to understand where we're at.
Okay. Well, thanks for everyone for the introductions. This is a panel discussion, so we welcome questions from the audience. So think about questions as you're sitting out there. If you have a question that comes to you while they're addressing somebody else's question, there's pieces of paper sitting on the table. So feel free to write it down, and Barbara will be circulating and picking those up as well. Yeah, send them that way, and we'll make sure we address it. You can also raise your hand. I mean, it's a small group. This will work out just fine. I'm going to start off with a question, and actually this is probably for Ray. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, we've heard some great anecdotal stories about some of these extreme events and some of these things that have impacted our area in the past. What can we expect in terms of future climate change? So what are the predictions showing for sort of the upper Midwest?
Okay, well, one thing I would draw your attention to right off, what I'm going to present is out of the National Climate Assessment Report, which was just published in May, which is the best and most recent policy report available on what we've seen and what are expected. And basically what we've seen in the last decade or two or three is forecast to continue or expected to continue through the future. We've seen increases in annual precipitation in our part of the world. We've seen increases in stream flow and also increases in runoff. And the runoff in particular falls into this distribution area where we seem to be, our weather patterns seem to be locking in to either wet or dry periods. We don't get that variability as much as we used to years and years ago. So if you're wet, you can tend to be wetter, and if you dry, you lock into these dry patterns, which is certainly problematic for a number of different areas, not the least of which is ag production. We've seen increases in soil moisture trends upward in the upper Midwest, but with a flavor of seasonality on top of that. Those increases have been primarily a spring and early summer phenomena, and the latter summer and the fall have tended to be on the drier side. The challenge there is when our soil is most vulnerable to erosion in crop production areas, it's going to be in the spring, so you increase the frequency of heavy precipitation in the spring, you increase erosion and all the negatives of sediment, the pollution and water quality issues that come across with that. We've seen an increase in the magnitude of river floods, and that too is expected to increase through the future. Of course, the temperature impact, one of the projects I'm working on with the Fish and Wildlife Service, if any of you are familiar with the Iowa Pleistocene snail, it's a glacial relic here that exists in some algific talus slope microclimates that occur in the driftless area in our part of the world. And the question they're facing is, what sort of a future are they looking at for this snail and its associated ecosystem? Is this something they can protect, or are we going to warm sufficiently that protection is not going to be a practical thing? So the temperature aspect on the ecosystem, the northward push of the north woods, and certainly there are folks here more expert than I am on that type of a thing, but the temperature is a critical aspect too.
Thank you. Other questions that people have? You do, no, you're welcome to just raise your hand. I just sometimes do think of a question. No, here you go.
Hi, I'm Susan Heathcote with the Iowa Environmental Council and Iowa River Survival. And one of the big issues we're looking at in Iowa is the extensively tile drain landscape. We've really altered the hydrology of this very flat landscape, and where we have a lot of very productive soils and corn, soybean, row crop agriculture. And we're seeing some things that are really kind of, essentially we are seeing actually further tile drainage because of some of the things you mentioned, the wetter springs, and of course that's the critical time to get started with your field work. But we're also seeing something very unusual this winter. We're seeing a lot of nitrates that are moving through our tile drain system in the winter time, and we're, for the very first time, the Des Moines Water Works has had to run the nitrate removal system during the winter, where they're looking at levels up in the upper part of the watershed coming out of some of these tile drainage districts of 40 milligrams per liter, that they've reported as high as 70 milligrams per liter. And primarily, this is when the land is frozen. And so we're looking at some of those levels, really it's groundwater dewatering in those tile drainage systems. But you know, how does this altered landscape, how does this fit into this climate change? I don't exactly know where to start because it's really, we're seeing some things we've never seen before.
Well, that's on the fringe of my expertise, so I might put the hydrologist on the spot here.
Well, I mean, I think, I was talking to Karen, I think there's other people who are more informed than I, but I think if I was king, I keep running and I only get one vote. My wife doesn't even vote for me, but I think I'd start looking at these ditch systems and drainage systems as water management systems, not water removal systems. And I think that I think there's a lot of opportunity there to think of them differently, and to consider the water that you're trying to get rid of so aggressively in the spring. Are there ways that you can retain them in the ditch systems or in close proximity of these fields and make them actually economically attractive to retain there? So that's, I don't know, I'll defer to what Karen and your work down there is, but I think that's a kind of a neat thing to think about, and I've been thinking about it for a long time, but I'm sure other people have been thinking about it harder, smarter about it, but I think that might be a neat outcome.
And if people in the crowd have comments on the questions,
Yeah,
they're
just-
being asked to-
Yeah. Just raise your hand. Yeah.
Proposing to put wet ones back in? Just curious.
Well, I've got some thoughts, but they're not necessarily informed, but I think there's some ways, I think you can try and manage, oh, I'm sorry. Again, I don't pretend there's a lot of people smarter than I thinking about this and whatever, but I think there's ways to think about it, not necessarily surface storage in wetlands, but actually management of your water table and some other things that maybe still allow you to get in the spring to get and work your field, but then not necessarily retain that drainage system that is meant to work really well in April and May, but then works to your detriment for the remainder of the growing season. So instead of having this passive system that works really well in the spring and then walking through and go, oh shucks, I don't have enough water here in August, are there some things you can do to be a little bit more active manager of the water as opposed to a entity just trying to get rid of it in the spring? So that's kind of my 2 cents or 1 cent.
Marty, so you're thinking more of like a shut-off valve for tile drains?
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I don't want to get too far over my skis, but I think it's maybe even more than that. It's actually management of the water in the ditches itself. And then that kind of quickly folds into how you manage those systems and the water regime in those systems. And I think Iowa, are you taping this? Maybe you can shut this down and I can talk. So posterity ignorance here or something, but I think there's some to think about managing the water in those systems, because Iowa's a little bit different, because I don't know that it, my opinion as a Minnesotan, I guess, but it may not necessarily be stream restoration, all these things. I think they're kind of stream construction, in that there's new streams where they're, or at least very markedly different streams than what it was. It's not restoration. It's kind of it's maybe thinking kind of big picture how these systems work and how you can manage them. I don't know if that made any sense, but anyway, get what you pay for.
No comment.
So I'll add one thing to that, and then we'll take another question. And that I know there are people working on engineering solutions to some of these things. So there are controlled drainage. You can actually install things and shut the tiles off temporarily. They're also putting things like bioreactors into drain tiles. And so that might be something that becomes more prevalent, particularly if we have nitrates in groundwater that are leaching out during the winter. So there are engineering solutions, I think, to some of these problems, and it's maybe a matter of steering the conversation towards thinking about, I like the idea of thinking as a management system for your water, not just a removal system for the water.
Right.
So we had a question over here.
Well, if I may, I want to start with a little bit of insight kind of to the topic that we were talking. Some of the extensive modeling that we did in the Des Moines area and the 4 Mile Creek, we dealt with the personal storage and modeling. And one of the great insights that I got in doing that modeling was the effect of the storage on those depressions. So when you go talk about tiles, for example, are they good or are they bad? The things that in some cases what we were finding as well, if that tile was restored, some of that storage there, it could have a benefit. Now, to put in context, for instance, we did the simulations with the 2010 actual rainfall, and one of the interesting things, and I'll turn this into a question for you, Ray, is the weather pattern. It wasn't such a high intense rain, but it was the cumulative amount of rain. So basically, the event that led to a very high peak was less than 3 inches of rain over a period of about 6 hours. But the previous 2 days basically saturated the whole landscape to the point that all the farm fields and areas, all these depressional storages were all saturated, so they basically just contributed straight to runoff, to the point of view that, I mean, people from the Des Moines, Pleasant Hill area were saying, like, okay, if the flooding is attributed to the urban development, and one of the things from the Mali that came about is that, well, when your whole landscape is saturated from all the preceding rain, when you have long periods of wetness, then basically even all those depressional storages that are producing that temporary storage were gone. Turning into a question for you, Ray. I hear sort of 2 messages. I mean, one of them is like with this climate change, we're turning into higher highs, higher intense rains, but on the other hand, we're also experiencing not necessarily so high with respect to peak intensities, if we're talking about hours, but more long duration wet periods, so I would like you to elaborate on what you were talking about, wet to dry, in the context of also the high intensity events.
I think the wet and dry periods, we're looking on the order of what we've experienced is on the order of weeks to months to seasons, kind of in that time frame, rather than an annual basis. And what we've seen, if you remember back in 1993, we got locked into that certain pattern. And you're right, the way certainly we look at river flood forecasting, we're blessed in Iowa with very deep soils over most of the state, and that those soils are a great reservoir, but once they're saturated, like you were saying, then Iowa becomes a big asphalt parking lot, and the water just runs right off. And that's where we were at in 2008, because we got these storm systems through repeatedly. In fact, the unique thing about Iowa State, and this was shown by work done at the University of Iowa, hydraulic modeling, is that the way the precipitation features for the week or two prior to the peak of the 2008 flood laid out was that it maximized the hydrograph, or the peak of the flooding, as the systems moved, the rain-producing systems moved downstream as the peak of the hydrograph was moving downstream. And the final kicker in Cedar Rapids, and I was actually working that night when it happened, is we had an event that in the middle of a drought would have been a traditional flash flood with some degree of urban but also a rural component, and that occurred as this peak of the river flood was coming through town, and that was really a disaster upon a disaster. And that got me to looking at some of the record press, and again, I'm stretching a little bit beyond my area because I'm not a hydrologist, but it's interesting, if you look at the peak flows on some of the area rivers, many rivers have a record peak that's substantially different than the second, third, and fourth highest peaks. And what I wonder if happened, and this would be a great question for the folks at Iowa, is this a scenario, because when you get into these wet patterns where you essentially get a flash flood on top of a river flood because you've been in these persistent wet patterns. Of course, the flip side of that, I mentioned the drought. We might not be in the persistent wet pattern. Perhaps it's Minnesota and Wisconsin that are in that persistent wet pattern, which then means our part of the world is in the persistent dry pattern. And that's the persistence. Usually with the flooding, it's not so much one event. You know, it's once we get those farms fields saturated and you start raining on top of that, then you start to see the sheet runoff in the farm fields and whatnot, and that's problematic. Another thing we noticed over the years too, especially in the transition season from winter to spring, and we had a very deep frost depth by our standards, about 3 to 5 feet across much of Iowa. As that was thawing, we would get these heavy spring rains. The top couple of inches of soil would have thawed, but below that there would be a frost layer, and that is just ready-made to transport all that soil off the top. And I don't know that anybody's looked at the frequency of that type of scenario occurring in the past, but I know that seemed to be particularly problematic last year with the deep freeze we had.
Other questions?
I have a question about woody debris and removal. I work for MS4, and the panic mode is when it rains hard and the trees fall, you've got to get them out of there because you're going to flood up, the culverts and bridges, and it's going to cause more flooding. So that's been the knee-jerk response from us, is to go in there and periodically take all the debris out of it, all the mirrors and the sweepers and everything that's in the stream and pull them out, because God knows what's going to cause a problem. My job is I managed to slow that process down a little bit, but I still have to balance that out. Is there a recommendation for, maybe an amount or a frequency of some deadfall in there, or maybe placing these things on purpose in certain areas to try to improve habitat, but also balance it out with perception of the people? Because I work with people of course, I don't know if you guys know that or not, but dealing with the public is not easy when it is. So if there's a way you can help with that, it'd be great.
I'm sure you guys have, I just make one quick comment, I'll pass it on here, but my opinion is that, like in Duluth and other places where crossings were designed with traditional Clearwater design guidance and standards, that does not accommodate debris passage. So in forested areas or areas with with woody debris passage, my opinion is after an event, that's a great opportunity to go out and look at your infrastructure and the failings of your infrastructure. So instead of going out and take a look and say, what's wrong with the stream, I think that's an opportunity to go out and say, what do we need to change with the infrastructure? It's a harder question. It's a question that you probably should offer before the large event occurs. But I think the problem is that people want to get in and start monkeying with the stream, whether it's large woody debris supply or passage, but it's probably the crossing design, which is the biggest thing. So I think having a little bit longer perspective and a little bit different perspective of where you want to spend your money. Spend your money on modifying infrastructure that was designed potentially improperly and exposes the risk, whether that's sanitary crossings, sanitary alignments along the riverine corridor, or road river crossings that are insufficiently designed. Modify the infrastructure, not necessarily the stream.
Yeah, I agree with Marty on that. Most of my experience with the infrastructure is that it's gone, but still the fear that you're talking about, Brian, that of getting in there and removing all the wood is the first reaction. One of the things coming from the West is that in the eastern half of the U.S., it's a culture of wood removal. We've been de-snagging, removing wood from streams for the last 300 years back here. And understanding how wood moves, the function, the size, everything else. Just for an example, in Vermont, I would go to these communities and developments and they were getting ready to remove all this wood. Well, a lot of the wood was up, they experienced upwards of Q500 flows. So you have all this wood that's really up high and actually a benefit to them in a future flood from a buffering standpoint. You also have some of these larger trees that are falling in with entire root systems. The way that wood moves in the system, those pieces have essentially anchors. So it's a matter of proximity to undersized structures like Marty was saying, And actually going through and doing a little bit of math for buoyancy. And you could do that qualitatively based on what you think the flood elevations are and how big those trees are and what proximity they are to critical infrastructure. Most of the things that we want to try to avoid is cutting things up and making more canoes in these kind of situations. Also, the modifications that Marty was seeing is how do we transition? Streams come in, a lot of times we have an undersized structure, so we set up this eddy system during large events that instead of the trees and debris coming down like canoes, they get crossways and get hung up at the inlet. We've documented this for a long period of time. Other things to do is think about failure when you're doing design. We have a design flood. We know that at some point in history, everything will fail. And how it fails is ultimately critical. A lot of what I had seen was that the failures in Vermont and New Hampshire, the roads failed as dam break events, which caused higher floodways and more property damage going downstream. So hence another case for go big or go home when we're talking about drainage structures.
Great question about the woody debris. In the city of Duluth, we have 16 trout streams within the city, and we recognize that woody material in the streams makes great habitat. So the only removals we're doing is really in front of culvert inlets or bridge inlets where it's really threatening that crossing. Otherwise, most of it is staying.
I mean, I just one quick thing I guess I think is critical for, especially for city infrastructure and I guess really all infrastructure, but is how you think about streams. And someday I'll bore you guys with another presentation about thoughts about how people look at streams. But as engineers and as managers, when we think about streams, instead of thinking of them as stable systems or they're mostly stable or that we want them to be stable, but you think about they can move. Not necessarily all streams move all the time, that they're real dynamic, but they can move and they will at some point. And then how do you design your infrastructure with that understanding that they can move? And I think when you step in and you start designing your infrastructure with that perspective as opposed to I've got a static form and if it deviates from that form it's broken and I'm going to design assuming a static form. You end up with a very different design perspective, concept of risk, and different actually designs that are being implemented. So I think if you look at streams as being able to change and how they will change, that'll inform your design a little bit better.
I'll add a few specifics to what they just said. So in terms of large wood, and one thing you do is design your culvert to least bankable width. And if you have an existing culvert, you're kind of stuck with any replacements. If you can at least out to bankable width, they're much more likely to transmit the wood. The other thing is, I think there's not a lot of research, but the research that exists is most of the mobile wood is bankable width or less. If it's longer than bankable width, it tends to hang up and anchor, especially if it has root blocks. So that might help you sort of select which wood immediately upstream from your structures that are vulnerable to remove. And then probably the last thing is alignment. Bob hit on it somewhat, not only undersized structures, but if your alignment's not very good, you also get eddying and wood will hang up and start to flood the structure too. So a few things to consider, generally.
I guess one other thing, if you're getting kicked off your duck divot, but whoever gets to pick the life cycle gets to pick the design. So if you you save an event and it blows out, you can say, well, here's the deal. We can clear out this wood and whatever else, but we'll leave the structure as is. Then does everybody promise that there won't be any wood the next time this event occurs? And are you going to be the one person getting up at 3 in the morning on Saturday to make sure that doesn't occur? Or we can recognize that could happen and spend our money here on this infrastructure that might be designed. It's got an initial higher capital cost, but if you do the life cycle cost and the risk, you're actually going to come out better. So if you force that life cycle cost discussion, you can infer different designs.
So I have a question, since I don't see any hands leaping up yet. There's been a lot of talk about how infrastructure fared during these extreme events, and talking about things that you should plan for in the future. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about some of the barriers to designing infrastructure to being able to pass wood or deal with more extreme events. So what are some of the impediments that we face as we try to size things for a changing climate or to have additional wood coming through the system?
This is when we really needed the FEMA person here.
Sorry.
One of my observations is that there's negative reinforcement from a flood response standpoint from helping communities and road owners in recovery. The laws are changing, and I'm not cognizant of all the current changes since Tropical Storm Irene, but you get funded on a percentage basis based on what you had there before. So why would we replace a structure that failed with the same size structure, knowing that it failed? So it gets to be a cheap cost for the owner because they have to minimize their upfront costs, but from a societal cost, who pays for all this? We all do. So the laws have to change as far as betterment. Now, there has been some betterment changes allowed for ERFO, the emergency relief for federal-owned road systems. And, maybe Chris could talk a little bit about your guys' FEMA relationship. And
Yeah, FEMA was actually not terrible to work with for us. I know there was a perception that FEMA is really difficult, and there is a lot of paperwork, but in general, they were pretty good about funding larger structures if the design standard changed or if there were fish passage requirements. FEMA was okay to work with. A constraint for larger infrastructure is cost, and to design for a 20% larger culvert, it's not just 20% more cost; it could be double the cost. So that's a biggie for us.
so, you mentioned if there's a change in the design standard. So is that a change before the event happened or a change after the event happened?
Good, I believe before the event happened. So if the culvert that washed out was installed 60 years ago, at the time was designed to pass a 100-year flow event, now we're replacing it with a new culvert, larger, but designed to pass a 100-year flow event. FEMA would cover a percentage of that, and the state picked up the rest in general. So we did put in we didn't replace with existing sizes, we replaced a new standard. So things went in larger and stronger than they were before.
Yeah, so it comes down to that if you want to get that benefit, one, you have to change the design standards that you're working with. And what that means is it's not the design standards for just those structures that have failed. It's what you do in the future with every drainage structure that you're doing. So instead of having, say, a Q25 flow that you're designing for, you bump everything up to a Q100 design flow. Then you can get that upgrade. But if not, and this is where in dealing with a lot of they have a unique political structure in New England. There's a lot of, each of the individual cities and towns kind of run their own business. And they don't necessarily want to go to a larger standard because of the cost involved with going up there. So again, we're in this, how do we break this bad cycle?
Actually, I got I've been given some presentations on the history of design, and I gave it to MnDOT, gave it to ASC last year, and the history of design, and it's some tradition in there. So we all think that Clearwater design of crossings came down from Mount Sinai. It was like the third tablet that didn't quite make it down. It really has only been since the 60s. Rational equation is not that old because of some, if you look at their area curves, that's how the railroad crossings were designed. They were initially, a lot of the infrastructure was designed at bankful width, not because they had large flume studies on fish passage, but because it was easier to put those in than to move dirt. And it was really in the 50s and 60s when these culverts became more economical to move dirt, and then some of the design guidance for Clearwater design, crossing design, came into play. So what I offer those folks is, it's okay. It didn't come, I mean, things changed. Design standards change. And I think the one thing that's important is to come back and to talk to them. Not, there's a lot of biologists that come in and maybe have talked to engineers and say, I've got a great idea. If you double the price of your infrastructure, it'll solve all my problems. And that's not a really good marketing ploy. But if you think about it from a risk perspective, and that Clearwater design, the historical Clearwater design, doesn't account for debris passage, you know, as Dale mentioned, and your bankful width passage, then you're increasing your risk. You're increasing the risk to the traveling public. And as a professional engineer, you're now putting your name on something that is problematic, and either you should be concerned about or your company's liability insurance carrier is going to be concerned about, because I'd be hard pressed to be in a problem where a crossing fails and somebody dies. That's the most people die as they're out traveling around in floods. And somebody dies, and you go to the judge, and the judge says, so how did you accommodate debris passage? And you say, well, I assume there wasn't any wood. Really? Let's go take a look out there and tell me what you think. And I would not want to be in that position as an engineer, telling folks that I did not accommodate that. So I think that's where you're going to run into, or that's where you're going to make headway, is talking about liability, talking about design issues, talking about the history of design. And then Bob was really instrumental in developing the new design guidance and thinking about that and applying those design standards. So that's where you get the headway, I think.
I'll add 2 quick points to that. One, on the flash flood safety. Certainly from a Weather Service perspective, we know public education of hazards is an ongoing issue and a huge challenge to get people to understand, don't drive into these flooded areas. For those of us who work with these type of issues, that seems a very common sense, logical thing. But what we're finding from some of our sociological studies, that people who do drive into these flooded areas, for example, are on their way to work and are more concerned about the potential of losing their job if they can't get to work versus losing their life if they drive through the stream. So the societal aspect to the public safety and design thing is a real challenge. Now, on the climate projection side, I'll share, we've had some discussions with the city of Davenport. We have a great rapport with the Public Works Director there. And I think they're pretty clear on, with the NOAA Precip 14 Atlas, that very well substantiates the need for increased size of culverts, for example, and whatnot. But the concern is, if I'm putting something in with a 50-year lifespan, what's the climate going to look like 50 years from now? Because I've got to consider that in design. So the challenge becomes essentially, what is the NOAA Precip 14 Atlas going to look like in 2050 or 2070? And that's where, from the climate perspective, that's extremely challenging to get those numbers out there. The climate projections are a range of possible outcomes. The fact that we're going to be warmer in weather in our part of the world in the coming decades isn't too hard of a reach to make that statement. But what that really means for design purposes is a serious challenge. So you're weighing uncertainty of what the future is going to be versus the cost, and that's where things with tight budgets can be a real challenge.
Make one final comment, my apology, but I think one other thing that is important is to have a more nuanced discussion about our limits of understanding and knowledge and how we treat streams. So if you do a Clearwater hydraulic design and you pick NOAA 14 or TP40 or something like that and you use, it's going to rain 5.1 inches, I've got a type 1 distribution, here's my roughness, etc. Okay, the flood elevation is 640.21, great. And if I'm at 640.22, I'm safe. If you really look at all the error bars associated with the precipitation depth, the intensity curves, your roughness values, and a bunch of other stuff, and you say, you know what, it's 640 plus or minus 3 feet, you have a really different management perspective. And I work a lot with engineers, or used to work a lot more with city engineers, and that would kind of make them grumpy because they just want a line. You know, it's like, just tell me a line and I'll build the house a little bit higher or whatever else. But that really infers a greater understanding than it actually occurs in these natural systems. So if we have a more nuanced discussion and you say, yeah, 100 years, 640.2 plus or minus a couple feet, you really end up with a different management perspective and a different design, I think. You can hit me now. I won't talk about it.
So we got a question back.
Microphone, so
Sorry, he got me earlier.
I mean, if these questions are related, I'm going to was going to shift it a little bit, but if there are questions that are related to this topic, we can keep going.
Do people have follow-up questions for this, or?
Mine was more a comment.
Okay.
When I worked for Corps of Engineers, I was a bit frustrated because we use statistics to predict flood elevations. So a 100-year flood has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. These are based on all the records that we have. So that goes back to the 30s or earlier lots of times. My frustration was that statistically, the last 20 years with the higher flood elevations and rain patterns and stuff like that is not significantly captured in a 1% chance of a flood. So when we changed the design criteria and we designed for a 100-year flood, that might not represent a 100-year flood for the last 20 years. Everything has to play catch up. So in my talks with the H&H at Rock Island, I talked about the possibility of coming up with a moving 25-year length period of looking at things, come up with flood elevations for the most recent period of time. You still need to look at the overall, but this would supplement that. That was, and it wasn't done, it can't be done, or under the current environment. So I think that states or counties have the opportunity, they don't necessarily have to adhere to what the Corps of Engineers found. And that might be something that you look at when you design the infrastructure or going through that process.
Yeah, I think it's an important point. I guess the other thing too, if you think about, if you look at long duration records and the impact potentially of the drought of the 30s, that was a pretty big drought, and it can have a pretty big impact on your frequency curves. And so you can do an analysis that takes out that drought and see what your frequency curve. Alternatively, you can maybe try and look at some other different changes on that. But the other thing, if you look at, I guess 2 points. One is, I don't know, everything evolved or devolved or something. There's nothing that magic really about the 100-year event. I've talked to some folks who were in some of the initial conversations in the 60s about where that came from. again, that wasn't the fourth tablet that came down Mount Sinai. It's an event that's kind of offers some risk and some liability distribution, but there isn't that magic. And sometimes if you do a non-clear water design, if you look at some of the other things, the 100-year kind of ends up taking care of itself. And then I guess the final thing is if you look at these events, like a 100-year event, and you use the GS state equations and whatnot, the standard error of some of those is 40%. So, you know, you look at, it's somewhere between 700 and 1400 CFS. I could have done that. You know, so you have to still use a judgment, and that's one problem is I would get into discussions with structural engineers and other kind of folks who would just take that, it's like, the mean it says it's 418 CFS, because it says so right here. It's like, no, that's plus or minus, and that's where your judgment of hydrologists and other things come into play, and it's not only that, but also it's a risk-based decision as well. So it's not a black box, you know, I hit it, it's 482, here's my and here's my design. And as much as maybe AutoCAD or other kind of things kind of think it's an automated process, it's really a much more involved process, and there is a very specific role for the professional engineer to be engaged in that and think about those things. And so it's not quite as tried and true as maybe like my University of Minnesota education allowed it. You need something.
Yeah. All right, so we have a question over here.
So I've done some FEMA work in the Milwaukee area. We had big storms in 2010, and I wanted to get back to the design and what they'll fund to repair. You can get into a mitigation project covering an emergency cost, and it's, you know, it takes a little bit longer. You can do it post, you know, disaster. But one of the things that we learned was it was really beneficial to have a little bit of an inventory of some of the infrastructure that was at risk and some really basic costs and repairs, so that when the disaster does come, you're ready to give them the numbers for that mitigation project and go right into the right fix. And looking at it from their perspective, and how would they possibly fund all projects to, you know, final mitigation design? That would be possible.
One thing I offer is in that is that for crossing, they were amenable to bringing things up to code or up to the new design standard. And as Bob mentioned, if there's a new design standard, you can't really say, I'm going to replace it back in kind, and it's got to be to this old design standard or the new design standard. So they seem to be, there's one crossing in particular that they really upsized and put in big floodplain culverts, and it was a heck of a lot more money than what was there. And in that discussion, I think it was bringing it up to code. So maybe laying some of that baseline of what your new design standard might be may offer some more opportunity for discussions with FEMA.
Codify it.
Yeah, and I'll talk to you more.
Bring the microphone back. So we have one comment here, and then I think we'll go back over here for a question.
The Illinois State Water Survey, their climatology section was run under Stan Shagnon and Jim Gill. They did a climate study for the crop insurance. And they were asked to go back 1,000 to 2,000 years and look at what was quote unquote normal before we had global warming. And those people found out, and the crop insurance people were very unhappy with them because they found out 10 to 50-year cycles of drought and flood. And they looked back to the record in terms of Indian tribes in Iowa becoming unable to eat because of the droughts. And they could walk across the Mississippi River and go to Illinois, where they were received by Indian tribes that didn't like them, and they put them in the ground. And there was records of that in the record too. And their conclusion was that if you don't know what the past record was, your prediction of what happens with global warming is really
All right, so go back to the question over here.
So this may be related to that somewhat, but I guess this is for Ray. A couple weeks ago, NASA launched a satellite, the Soil Moisture Active Passive Observatory. I've just been trying to find out more about this. I don't know if you know anything about it, or if this is data that NOAA will be using, but it seems like the data coming from this would be useful for watershed management. The NTC, the soil moisture, has a big impact on runoff. I've just been trying to find out more about this. I don't know if you know anything about it.
Satellite's not one of my primary areas of expertise, but I know NOAA is also going to be launching a new satellite in about 16 months that might provide more data for these types of things. But my background with my master's degree is actually in ag climatology, so I've done some stuff with crops and remote sensing and whatnot. And I know satellite estimation of soil moisture, the biggest challenge there is getting past the vegetation and trying to separate the two things. And if somebody had that magic key that could just pull out the soil moisture, I have a bunch of modelers at our Environmental Prediction Center who would like to talk to them, not to mention the folks that do our hydrologic modeling up in Chanhassen and down in Kansas City. That's a big challenge, trying to separate that vegetative component from the soil component. But regarding whether that data would be of value to you folks, I'm not really qualified to answer.
One of the, just kind of Cliffy Clavin fact is for, like if you're using AMC 1, 2, and 3, people use a curve number method, and that's supposed to, really talk about the moisture regimes, wet, normal, and dry. If you look at the original data, that actually just shows the variability in the initial data. It was the spread in the data. And they said, well, it's a spread, I don't know. Maybe it was dry, maybe it was wet, and they attributed it to that, and that's how it came to that. It wasn't necessarily that they took the data, this is wet, this is dry, but that's what they used to describe the spread. So it's a Cliffy Clavin fact, but the point being is that that 72 plus minus whatever, there's actually quite a bit of range in there, and to understand what the genesis of that AMC 1, 2, and 3 is, that helps you maybe have some freedom and getting away from what AMC 1, 2, and 3 actually is. And it might actually be closer to a wetter condition, even though it's normal, whatever else. So it's just something to think about. And anyway, Cliffy Clavin fact.
A question up here?
It seems to me that on some sort of climate change topic, that really sort of the basic question here is, do we still believe that the history is a good predictor of the future? And if we're having doubts about that, how do we amend our planning and management to take some precaution because we have our doubts? And so I'd like to put the panel in sort of a hypothetical situation in Iowa. So in Iowa, after 2008 floods, a bunch of HUD and FEMA money and some state money went into using the LIDAR base and having University of Iowa Flood Center modernized based on LIDAR, the modeling and maps for the entire state. And so now we have perhaps the most accurate maps anywhere being published for a 100-year 1% probability and a 500-year 0.2% probability. They also can deliver a 250-year map or a 50-year, so they got more capability. So my question for you, since we have been experiencing more extreme flood events for about 35 years, and the modeling for 2050 for climate change is expect additional extreme events for the next 35 years. If you were in city council and reviewing an ordinance, a planning ordinance, would you still be using the 100-year maps as the threshold for planning, or would you tend to move to a 250 or a 500 or a 500 plus?
Come on, City Council.
I better grab it before Marty does.
I really wanted to second.
You know, I never like to think in absolute figures when I'm doing design. I always, and Marty and everybody else here has been saying, you know, we live in a range. So I think it would be a tiered approach. Some of the things interagency group of state, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, we just put out a publication in AFS last year on economic analysis and stream simulation. So one of the things, you know, I guess that I would ask is what was our maintenance cost beforehand with our standard? Did we have to have crews out there all the time clearing? And try to use some of that history to guide what has happened in the future. And one of the things we found is that nobody keeps track of maintenance. It is this big black hole out there that, hey, we've always done it, we got a crew. There's no tracking mechanism. There's a large, and I forget what the acronym means, but it's going to be an NCHIRP report. Interfluve and Lewis Berger Group is involved in it right now, looking at hydraulic design versus stream simulation. And this gets back to flood. How can you satisfy debris and water passage during unknown floods? And also keep in mind that when something goes out, there's a cost to all your constituents. So looking at that, doing critical infrastructure, what's critical, what should we do now, what shouldn't you do now? And designing with that in mind that, hey, you know, if this structure goes out here, half of the town can't get to work. So I would apply a different standard at that location versus something on a rural road where you might inconvenience a couple of residents out there.
Actually, I'm going to make you give it to Chris now. Because I know he actually has these decisions.
Yep, I just said one quick thing is, one quick thing is I wouldn't worry, the 100 year is plus or minus whatever, it's kind of a fanciful human construct for zoning. And so I wouldn't worry so much about, is this the right 100 year, because the rainfall distribution has a greater impact than the rainfall depth. And that's all fanciful stuff that people came up in cloud rooms. So I would have a tendency, I'm not that concerned about what the 100 years is, but I would maybe come up with different ordinance requirements, like a plus a 2 foot, your 100 year plus 2 foot, or 100 year plus 4 foot. Something like that, that would be based upon risk and not worry about, is it 916.4 or 961 point whatever else.
I would disagree on the maintenance comment because we do track our maintenance on all storm sewer assets, so we do track and maintain that.
Well, you are the exception to the rule. And we have the stuff to prove it too.
Great question on the hypothetical. I think on the infrastructure design, we still design to a 100-year design standard for infrastructure, and if there's a good reason, whether it's a important crossing, like Bob mentioned, or if there's fish passage concerns or debris concerns, we will upsize. But you know, in Duluth, when you have a string of culverts on the hillside, you can't just upsize 1 or 2 crossings. You have to look at the whole system. So if it's possible to upsize the entire system, that's great. But otherwise, we stick to the 100-year design standard.
Well, the thing is, when we're redesigning for larger flow events, that's not the only component, because the FEMA flood maps that everybody uses, insurance is based on those elevations or where they're delineated. And that's a large cost and has a large impact on anything close to the rivers. So there's that economic incentive, not only for construction costs, but for the inhabitants of those areas, as far as flood insurance. And that makes a big difference in what people are able to do or are willing to do also.
Yeah, I understand the comments about land use and planning and the floodplain mapping, which I really can't speak to as much as the infrastructure side, but do you guys want to comment on the flood mapping?
I don't want to get into that.
I really can't speak to that.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time mapping kind of fanciful numbers that help us manage for zoning, but these are zoning maps and they're insurance maps at their genesis. And so one thing you could do is, we did in Oakdale, is look at a sensitivity. And so we looked at the 100-year with a type 2 distribution, and then ran a more intense distribution. Actually, type 1 and type 2 distribution was more intense, and that helped inform that freeboard. So that's something you could do, is look at the existing FEMA maps. That's what's zoned in, that's where you can go what else. Run a sensitivity in either with a higher rainfall depth or a different distribution or a different understanding of what the AMC might have been or something like that, and that might help inform that freeboard. So you're, instead of coming up with a 1 foot or 2 foot from whole cloth, it actually has some basis, and then you can actually maybe help accommodate that future risk.
The Weather Service has been working with the Iowa Flood Center to transition their floodplain mapping to operational use, and that's been a great success. We've also worked with the Illinois State Water Survey on the Illinois side of the river to do a similar thing. But one of the things I learned in working with Iowa, they had somebody looking at the integration of census data and other local spatial information with these floodplain maps so that they could look at a 1% flood or a 0.1% flood and see what are the economic impacts. And that's something that's helped not only in planning purposes, but also in response and getting a better understanding of where their economic risk lies rather than just the obvious physical structures.
Okay, we have a couple hands up here. Comment?
This past summer, right at the end of June, we had 6-7 inches of rain within a very brief period of time, resulting in serious flash flooding in several neighborhoods. You don't have to drive through a flash flood in our neighborhood. It comes to you and sweeps the cars away and piles them up in a local park. So I wonder how you all, as engineers and weather people, are weighing the risk or doing your planning according to the threats of flash flooding as compared with major inundations.
I don't want to talk about it, but I mean, you're talking about like the Mississippi River coming up and staying up for a month or two as opposed to kind of a flash flood locally? That kind of distinction, or?
Actually, nothing as big as the Mississippi, but perhaps the Cedar River coming up for a week. Planning for that, we're putting flood walls in and other flood protection measures to deal with that, and working upstream with other people, farmers and other jurisdictions to minimize the worst effects of that kind of flooding. But with the flash flooding, did not hit the whole city in June, but it was just a strip that came through in part of the city. And so our street in front of our house turned into a river. It was a former creek bed, I understand. Construction issues about building on ridges, streets on ridges rather than in depressions, and how do you take the worst edge off of flash flooding, which in our case, the water ran down our street and into another neighborhood and wiped out probably 20 houses. And the sewers backed up and couldn't manage. One of our engineers suggested that the solution was to put in a bigger storm sewer, which I'm not an engineer, but to me that's something very unrealistic. So I'm just wondering how do you all deal as planners with flash flooding in your communities so that you don't have this extensive property damage and the disruptions of life?
Great question. So in the city of Duluth, most of our city is on this steep hillside, so all of our floods are flash floods. We deal with them by installing either, oversized culverts on important crossings, as well as floodplain culverts, secondary culverts that are set higher to pass the high flows, but not the low flows. I guess that's not a great answer, but that's how we deal with them.
My background is geology, and I'd like to think that was educated by geologists, but I was raised by engineers. And an old road location engineer told me that the most important things in roads is location, location, location. That goes with any infrastructure that we do and understanding. So the reality is that in a case like you're describing, you may need to, if you're truly looking at the greater public good, it may require some property owners losing some of their property in order to facilitate a ditch, a drainage diversion, something in that order, for the good of the order. And that's where the politics starts coming in and kind of limits what you can and can't do.
So I see there are two people who've had their hands up for quite a while. So let's take these two questions and then we'll have a break so you can all run to the bathroom or coffee. Yeah. No, go ahead.
Okay, so I work for the Corps of Engineers, and while I don't design flood control projects, I have had to evaluate them. And when we do discharge frequency analyses, there's always the main line, but there's always confidence limits on it. So the confidence limits are like the 10% to 90% or 5%, 95%. And so the actual 100-year could be anywhere within those confidence limits. So then when we design flood control projects, there's always risk and uncertainty analyses that are done. And the quick and dirty one is just to use FEMA's 100-year plus 3 feet. But there's actual analyses that can be done to come up with what that should be. And so, for instance, there's this huge Fargo Moria project, huge diversion channel they're planning on putting in. I get involved in the geomorphology and mitigation side of it, not the design of it or anything. But for that study, they are using a wet cycle hydrology from 1940 to present. So that kind of takes into account getting rid of the drought.
Thanks.
Mine's more of a comment also. I also was a geologist trained by engineers. I don't know if you've seen on the news, but within the last year, there was a geologist in Italy who was sued because he couldn't predict an earthquake, which is unpredictable. There's no way you can predict that. And I guess it's like, it's almost like we're going down the same path. You know, the public has to be aware of the fact that there's so much uncertainty in all of this, in everything that we do. In our society today, when bad things happen, everyone wants to blame somebody. And so, like with the 2011 flood out in western Iowa with the Missouri River, I saw this happen a lot. I mean, there was the Corps put up levees, and they're trying to protect people, and they have the 100 and 500 year floodplain delineated, but yet the flood happened and the levee broke, and now everyone's trying to sue the federal government, trying to sue the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and to sue all these people because this happened. But you can't predict that. People have to assume some risk. We as
a body of people doing this work can't be blamed for the unpredictable.
Okay, I see one last desperate comment here, and then you get your break.
I was going to mention one quick thing. Individual engineers were getting sued for Katrina's failures too. I mean, and that the whole genesis of engineers, the engineering profession was to have that conversation of risk. Before that, there were just builders. Go build me a bridge, go build me a Versailles or something like that. There wasn't that conversation of risk. So the whole engineering profession is built upon that discussion of risk.
I know I'm preaching while I'm talking to the choir that knows a lot about this. But one of the things that I've been hearing in the last hour is a lot about upsizing and concentrating on like one structure, one road. I think we've gone very far in stormwater management, in managing our watersheds, and we have to continue looking at our watersheds as a system. What in one place may make sense, yes, we need to upsize to reduce the risk, liability, saving lives, maintaining our habitat and our streams. It may make sense in one location, but in many others, when you especially are in the headwater streams, where you may want to actually attenuate and facilitate that, as long as you're not creating greater waste because you are at that risk of losing that road or that embankment that is creating. So I think we have the science, we have the technology and the know-how, especially in this group, to try to responsibly also manage our system. So whenever we look at as a designer, sometimes, yeah, you get a place that the scope is this one bridge, and you don't control the others, and it's like, okay, and you have to decide to that 100-year, or do the risk analysis. The 100 years not always a peaceful one, and sometimes, yes, you're locked in, but that's where we need to move. And as motivators here for good resource management is we have to keep pushing in the direction of the watershed management to what makes sense. I think there's plenty of examples there, but I think we're all looking for a little bit of a break, so I'll leave it there.
That was a great way to end the first part of the panel discussion. That was great.
Yes, I agree. So we're going to take a 15-minute break, and there is our drinks in the back and bathrooms down the hallway. So please come back around 10:20, by my watch at least, and we'll continue this discussion. Thanks.